Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. My friends, there is a war on innocence right now. There is a war on the most innocent among us. And by the most innocent among us, I undoubtedly mean the nation's youth. Or, to make it even more broad, the youth of the West. Now, I don't do sensationalism on this channel. I believe that sensationalism allows our faculties to be overtaken by blind passion and thus obscures the truth from our grasp, from our sights. But as I do not deal in sensationalism, but I deal in truth, these statements that I'm saying are most certainly verifiable. My friends, there has been a furor erupting throughout America over the past few weeks that has been focused on how American society at writ large, because we understand that there are many societies. Society itself is a very abstract term, but how society writ large, for lack of a better term, a better word, regards its children, regards the youngest amongst us. And that conversation has been particularly playing out in the educational setting. Indeed, when Ron Desantis signed the Parental Rights and Education Bill, which has been slanderously, and almost, I would even say by some people who have written, libelously termed, they don't say gay bill, people of all sorts, of all political aisles, engaged in intense conversation about what is appropriate for children in the classroom and what is not appropriate for children in the classroom. And emerging from this debate appears to be a sentiment that it is indeed appropriate to teach children about grown-up sexual topics because the world itself is full of a variety of different people, i.e. intends to be conclusive. And then the other side of this debate basically says that it is inappropriate to do that. This is something that belongs to the parents. But my friends, this debate transcends the signing of that bill, because this debate has been going on for a very, very long while. Now, oftentimes, this debate is spurred by examples of clear indoctrination, like this.
Hi, my name's Az, and I'm a preschool teacher. So, my classroom celebrates diversity. It's probably my favorite thing to teach. We usually use kids' books to talk about this kind of thing. Recently, we started wearing pronoun pins, and the kids get to pick a new pronoun pin every day. We have some that pick like she, her every single day. And we have some that change it up.
Or this.
Hi, I'm a queer teacher, and I 1000% do not support this bill. And yes, I do know what's in it. The bill in itself is just another way to stigmatize the LGBTQ plus community. Kids as young as 3 and 4 are actually aware of their gender identity, even if they don't have the language for it. Also very aware of who they like and who they don't like. Heterosexuality is pushed on our kids on a daily basis at a very young age. Media, through books. The first Disney movie that you saw. To say that pre-K through 3rd grade are not ready for such topics is actually internalized homophobia and transphobia.
Or indeed this.
Man, y'all thought me teaching the children about me being poly was crazy. But not only that, but they also know that I'm gender fluid. At one point last year, I had explained to them that I was not Miss Lois or Mr. Lois. It's just Lois because I'm not a boy or a girl. And this was all well and good until October, when I also explained to them that I'm pagan.
My friends, you need not simply look at TikTok anecdotes to snuff out and understand what is going on here. We can also look at policy that has been set by the entire boards of education of certain states, like Maryland, where the Maryland Board Department of Education essentially determined in their health education framework that it is appropriate for pre-K students going all the way up to 4th grade to understand certain topics that even some adults have a hard time wrestling with, and that is topics surrounding gender identity and sexual orientation. Here we have from timcast.com. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd graders are expected to recognize and respect the various ways people may express their gender identities. Let me stop right there. Now, my friends, how can I recognize and respect something? Or rather, how can I respect something that I don't truly understand? Furthermore, actually, let me add that in. How can I recognize something that I don't truly understand? To recognize means to recognize. To cognize means to think, to engage in intellection. And intellection, at the ages that consist in pre-K, grade 1, grade 2, you're talking about 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds right now, the ability to cognize and the ability to engage in intellection is very crude, very primitive, and only a few things are understood. It is still forming in the minds of these new creations, these new births. Relatively new, at least, compared to the rest of us who get to the age of maturity and we grow up and we understand a little bit more about the world. So how can we recognize something when our cognitive faculties are rudimentary, number one? And then how can we respect that which we don't have an understanding of? And this is the epistemological flaw with moves like this, which are not unique to Maryland. There are indeed many educational institutions or governing bodies around the nation that think this is appropriate for first, second, and third graders. But then fourth graders, those students will be asked, according to the same Maryland standards, to identify sexual orientation as a person's physical or romantic attraction to an individual of the same or different gender. Now, students in grades 6, 7, and 8 should be able to explain sexual orientation, explain the differences between sex assigned at birth, gender identity, and gender expression. So from the age where kids are toddlers up to the age where they're prepubescent, because when you're in 8th grade, you're almost technically a teenager if you're not already a teenager. Throughout these ages, children are being fed a very particular narrative about what sexuality is, about what it means to have a certain idea of the self, when once again, the foundations for that narrative were planted in them when they were in first, second, and third grade. And therefore, they're already operating not from a blank state that might allow them to evaluate all sides of the argument or to see the variety of the senses of self that all of us may have, but instead to see a particular variety of a sense of self that is conferred through gender ideology. And this is why so many parents are enraged and incensed about what is happening in the classroom. This is not conspiratorial. This comes straight from the guidance of the Maryland Board of Education. But it's not just Maryland. But then again, it's also not just wokeness. It's also not just inappropriate conversations taking place in the midst of those who cannot recognize them. Rather, my friends, this reflects an even broader problem that has been happening for decades, and that reflects a fundamental tension within the American ethos. My friends, the fact that education, or it can include these things, reflects that education is not necessarily being formulated for the best interests of those who it addresses, but rather it is being formulated on a collective basis. My friends, this indoctrination we're seeing, and the indoctrination we have seen throughout American history, not just in terms of gender identity, but also in terms of other topics as well, is simply a result of what I call political communitarianism taking root in these boards of education, in these governing bodies, and manifesting in the most pernicious of ways. Now, let me walk through this, because most people have just been saying, well, these leftists are in our school, and they're trying to destroy our kids with all this stuff, and I understand the sentiment. But guess what? This didn't come out of nowhere. Everything, my friends, in this wide world is interconnected. We have a world that does not exist in a vacuum, but instead plays off of previous things. Nothing just comes out of nowhere. Nothing just happens. There are roots to what is happening right now, and you can see those roots of what is happening in number one, previous instances that are similar to it, and throughout history as well. And I'll explain those necessities with you in a moment. But first, allow me to define communitarianism. So, my friends, many of you may immediately think when I say the word communitarianism that I mean collectivism, and that is not what I mean. So let me first define both what those terms mean. Collectivism is it's basically a political mechanism, I would say, amongst many other things, that essentially does not view the individual as anything but a part of this cog, this broader overall abstract idea, which is oftentimes single-minded and goes towards a particular political aim. So a historical example of collectivism would be Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany did not see the German people as individuals or people. They saw them as a simple part of the blob that was the Aryan race. Or we could even say Benito Mussolini's Italy. Il Duce did not see Italians as individuals. In fact, in Il Duce's writings, he quite literally says that liberal individualism, the idea that all of us are individuals with rights, is actually a very dangerous idea, and that man does not exist independent of history or the family or the state. So both Hitler and Mussolini had terrible ideas, terrible rejections of the individual, but Mussolini's is all the more graphic, given how given how just, and then again, so was Hitler's. But anyway, all rejections of the individual are bad. Those are two examples of collectivism, disregarding the individual as a unit of any sort and simply regarding people as part of a mass. But of course, men are not masses. Men are indivisible individuals. Communitarianism is essentially this idea that human identities, and this is from the Sanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that human identities are largely shaped by different kinds of communities or social relationships. So it can be a community or a set of social relationships, and that human nature should, number one, this idea of human nature, how this kind of human nature works, should inform our moral and political judgments, as well as the judgments of our policies and our institutions. So all that means is that communitarianism simply says you're an individual, but you're not an individual by yourself. You're an individual that is an immediate and an intimate connection with either a community of people or with another set of social relationships. And these social relationships or these communities, that should be the basis for lawmaking. That should be the basis for society's institutions. That should be the basis for social action, not per se your rights or your individual desires or whims. So whereas collectivism completely and utterly murders the individual by absorbing it into this sort of abstract monster, communitarianism says, okay, you exist as an individual, but not just as an individual, or rather, not sufficiently, that's what it is, not sufficiently as an individual, but rather you are sufficiently a part of something bigger. Now, academically, there are not many individuals who profess this line of thought. There are people, however, who functionally most certainly do. Whenever you hear the talk of a common good, which is actually quite popular on both sides of the aisle, you are essentially hearing a talk about a certain kind of communitarianism. People like Michael Sandel, for example, the famous Ivy League academic whose scathing critiques of meritocracy are well received by many people across academia, although not so much by me, although that's probably a different video to make for a different day. He has indeed asked the question in many of his writings, what has become of the common good? Alistair McIntyre, who is someone that the post-liberals talk to me, just love to throw at me, just love to hit me with, who essentially critiques the idea of certain varieties of the Enlightenment. It's very complex. Certain varieties of the Enlightenment, and basically asks the question, where is virtue in all of this? He wrote the book Act for Virtue. Then you have people like John Rawls, who Sandel and others critique for his sort of individualistic ideas, his relatively individualistic ideas, although Rawls himself, by and through what he called his various principles and how justice should work, believed that we were obligated to other people in some way, shape, or form by necessity of having the means to do something. Now, of course, these are all very esoteric to some extent, although they shouldn't be esoteric, philosophical distinctions, but they're important if we're going to obtain depth in this matter. So there are very few academics that call themselves communitarians, but functionally they are communitarian, indeed. And there are very few politicians that call themselves communitarians, but functionally there also are communitarians. For example, Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, someone who I have a lot of mixed feelings about. I'm generally not comfortable with him because his policies towards gaming and things of that sort have demonstrated a desire to control aspects of society that he has a distaste for, rather than actually evaluating those aspects of society on the basis of their moral virtue or their moral righteousness. But whatever, mind you, that's secondary as well. Josh Hawley has called for a politics of home, in which he says, and I will quite literally read what his idea of a politics of home would consist of, in which he says, in that speech that he made, the idea of the politics of home, he says that our communities of home, in worship, in labor, tell us all this because they draw us into living these convictions together. And this country is built on those convictions. Now, he was referencing a set of convictions that he mentioned prior. I'll put the full speech in the description if some of you are not aware of what he's talking about. He also says, which means the future of this country depends on rebuilding the communities who make us who we are. So the idea of political communitarianism, the idea that, again, it's the institutions, the relationships that shape you, not your unique individual identity, is on full display in this speech. Because he also goes on to say this, and this is very telling. Because in the end, it is the community that makes authentic individual life possible. It's the community that gives individual strength. It's the community that helps us find moral purpose. Dear God, this is suicidal. It's the community that joined us together to exercise control over our lives. So according to Josh Hawley, you don't have, your rational faculties as an individual are not sufficient to exercise control over your lives. I would love to have a conversation with Mr. Hawley one day to go through this idea of philosophical communitarianism, perhaps at a later date. However, having said that, Marco Rubio also has this idea of communitarianism called the common good capitalism, that capitalism should be there to serve institutions and society, not simply individual pursuits of profit. So, how does this relate to our kids and how children are being assaulted by various ideas that they cannot recognize, as we established a few minutes ago? My friends, think about it. Education in the United States, at least, and this is going to be a very American-centric video. I'll make this point, though. The same trend is occurring globally. The same trend towards communitarianism and controlling what we understand and learn is occurring across the West. And perhaps at a later time I shall address that. But for now, this is for my American friends. Like me, American. The same mentality that undergirds Hawley, Sandel, Rawls, all different people expressing different strains of communitarianism, but having the same general idea, is the same mentality that enables school boards around the United States to function. What do I mean? Education, my friends, in the United States is like a few-tiered system in terms of what is established to be taught. So, in most states, the state government itself sets the standard. Now, there have been instances of the federal government trying to intervene by and through the Department of Education in state and local education. And there have been instances of the federal government giving grants or setting initiatives like No Child Left Behind, things of that sort. But generally, states dictate their own education policy. This is kind of what Common Core was. States adopting standards that would be similar across the board to ensure that if you learn something in Kansas, it's the same exact thing as you learned or similar in Georgia, to ensure that there's consistency across the board. And that's a different story. But states set their policy. And then state boards of education set the general policies for the entire state as well. And then localized school boards set policy for their local area. So sometimes they'll advise on dress code, sometimes they'll advise on certain books that are read, but the curriculum itself is set from the very top by the state government. And then there's all these enforcement bodies, the State Board of Education and localized school districts, which actually go ahead and not, I won't use that term that leftists use, do the work, but go ahead and implement that which was prescribed by the state governments. But if you think about it, school boards themselves are constituted of people in certain communities. And school boards are actually meant to reflect the desires of the communities. In fact, many school boards themselves will say it on their own websites and their own mission statements, that they seek to reflect the desires of the community in their policy setting. Which is why a lot of school boards are elected positions where people from the community take people from the community and put them into the position where they dictate basically what goes on a procedural level in public schools. Now, of course, there are also institutions that are insulated from this. They're called charter schools. They're independent. They still receive money from public bodies, but they're independent from the dictates of the state, the school board, and the school districts. But, my friends, when you have a community dictating standards for education through political bodies like school boards, you ultimately get not necessarily always the manifestation of what is correct for a kid's education, but what is reflective about what the community wants in education. That's precisely what happens. Because if a school board can set some kind of policy and it's a political body, it's going to reflect political aims. There's no such thing as a neutral political body. Intercommunitarianism. Education, by and through the existence of school boards and the State Board of Education, is no longer the idea of individually educating a particular pupil, but rather it is a collaborative effort that everyone has input on, and everyone's input may not be beneficial for the student, and it may not even be correct from a pedagogical standpoint. But again, it's politics. Why do you think so many public high school teachers are stressed out by the bureaucracy that rules over their school? Why do you think that so many teachers will tell you that indeed the bureaucracy actually holds them back from doing their job? Now, of course, there are plenty of teachers that don't actually do their job and actually try to do something different. But still, why do you think? Heck, to be even more philosophical, why do you think that some public school teachers are actually very concerned and very confused about what in the world their job is, and they go ahead to pursue their own desires? This doesn't come out of nowhere. Education in America is reflective, typically, of what the local community wants, not always what is correct. And that, my friends, is a form of communitarianism. And we can see this manifest across different jurisdictions, different areas, and different variations. So, for example, I have numerous examples of the document in front of me, numerous, and I will share this document with all of you at the end of this video. So on the left, because if we can dictate we can see how right-wing communitarianism guides certain schools, or left-wing communitarianism guides certain schools, we should be able to see this is a universal phenomenon that we need to get rid of. So on the left, communitarianism has manifested in several different ways in schools. Baltimore County, right after George Floyd died, endorsed a Black Lives Matter resolution where they quite literally say Black Lives Matter and we're going to implement equity, we're going to do all kind of things that again serves a narrow political purpose and has very little to do with educating kids on the universal principles of certain topics which will actually be actionable for them in the future as opposed to being temporal or part of a temporary political movement. I will read some of that resolution for you guys right now. The resolution passed by the Board of Education of Baltimore County says the following: whereas the problems plaguing society are often reflected in the schools and can be addressed by facilitating courageous conversations concerning systemic racism, social justice, racial and ethnic bias, and a unified effort of communities and schools coming together for all children, whereas our schools shall be safe havens that practice equality and equity, whereas Board Policy 0100 Equity affirms the belief that the school system must address and overcome inequity by providing all students with the opportunity to succeed. Okay, let me stop there. My friends, they are putting politically charged, narrow ideas into a resolution that is reflective of what the Board of Education of that district wants to see happen in their schools, which will then be carried out in some capacity by the principals and the administrators of those schools. This is what is dictating the kinds of educational activities which happens in these schools. A communitarian effort that comes from the Baltimore County Board of Education, and Baltimore County happens to be a progressive area. The progressive values of the county are being refracted and reflected through the Board of Education and then implemented in the school curriculum. That's communitarianism. And that kind of behavior is directly what leads to a one-sided classroom, is directly what leads to certain ideas being uncritically taught and uncritically challenged, or not challenged rather, in the classroom. But we can go even further. In North Carolina, the Board of Education also endorsed equity and said the following: the state board recognizes that historical and current systems of inequitable and inadequate resource allocation, disproportionate suspensions and expulsions, lack of access and to and supports for teachers of color, unequal access to educational opportunities and supports implicit and explicit biases and segregation perpetuate inequity in the outcomes of students. Again, this is a presumption that they are not challenging, that they're not even providing any proof for. They're just making assertions. And these assertions happen to align with a left-wing political narrative. Regardless of where you sit on the issue of inequity in education, on the issue of implicit or explicit biases, regardless of what you believe about those things, that is immaterial to the fact that there is a governing board of education that is treating all of these ideas as inviolable and intractable, as opposed to doing what good pedagogy does do and allowing people to challenge those ideas in a classroom, which should, if we're abiding by the rules of good pedagogy, be a place of conversation, not a place of indoctrination. But when these kind of diktats are handed from the top down onto students, onto teachers, then they are bound, knee and foot by these dictates. And that, again, does not encourage the spirit of inquiry. I can give you more. I'll give you only a few more because I'm exhausting the point here. Fullerton, California. The school district passed a resolution which claimed that anti-black racism was all over the country, and that it is the duty of them to fight it. Okay. The Anchorage School Board, now Anchorage, Alaska, passed an anti-racism resolution. In the Vermilion School Board, which is actually more recently in Vermont, passed an equity resolution which recognized transgender bathrooms in a very concrete way. Again, these ideas are not being challenged, they're not being dissected, they're being presented through the force of law, which basically means that if you challenge them, you're going against the authority and they can punish you. The Confederate flag, in a Virginia school board, this was an issue that really interested me. They reversed their decision to allow students to wear the Confederate flag in their memorabilia or in their dress code and banned it. And the only black member of that school board said, "I see this as a first step. A first step. I am very happy and believe it is long overdue about the Confederate flag ban. It concerns me that it took the horrible murder of a black man on national television for the board to come to this decision versus being open enough to listen to the African American board member, African American school administrators, and teachers, and the African American community." This is Penny Blue, who was on the Franklin County School Board, who was instrumental in getting Franklin County in June of 2020 to ban the Confederate flag from their students' dress code. Now, was this the battle flag or other iterations of the Confederate flag? Has she taken into consideration that the Confederate flag has not always been used as a symbol of hate, but is sometimes a symbol of cultural expression, even if that expression is tasteless? Are we now in the business of deciding good taste in terms of clothing? Is that something that is appropriate and part and parcel to what a school board or an educator should be doing? Should an educator not be, again, stoking the flames of inquiry within our souls to see if goodness, goodness being what is commonly accepted, be goodness? Why in the world is the school sending this kind of message? Again, it's communitarianism enforcing its subjective values onto students instead of actually encouraging students to grow in their knowledge. We're going to get to the big significance of this soon. But my friends, this doesn't just occur on the left. The right does it too. And this may make some of you upset, I understand. And full disclosure, I am a right-leaning conservatarian. I believe that America's traditions, especially those that promote and promulgate the individual, are fundamentally just and need to be preserved. But I also understand that there are factions on the right that are more concerned with furthering authoritarianism as opposed to furthering America's universal principles. From the right, there was a school board, and this is according to Daily Mail, that banned satanic clothing from their dress code and then reversed it when a local satanic group called Satanic Deco advocated for it to be reversed. This is in Pennsylvania. I'll read from the Daily Mail. A Pennsylvania school district that had banned clothing that was satanic in nature is changing its dress code after being accused of religious discrimination. Now, of course, the members of the community had this to say: "I wouldn't want a satanic or cultish anything on clothing in schools." Lisa Curtofolo, I can't say her name, of Clifton Heights stated. Another person: "It's a free speech issue. Are they going to allow Nazis to be able to put symbols on kids' shirts and send them to school?" why, yes, we should let people, no matter what kind of virulent form of political expression they wish to exhibit, we should let people wear those kinds of forms of expression, but we should also engage in discussion and critique it so that we can explain why having a swastika on you is not a good thing, that we can explain why the values of LaVeyan Satanism may not necessarily be best for the soul, so we can explain these things. But by banning them, we are simply allowing them to exist in other contexts, and we are not engaging in the radical truth-seeking that has constituted the grounds of a civilization and has also allowed human beings to move from the caves to the stars. And so the superintendent of this Pennsylvania school district justified the ban, or getting rid of the ban, in this way. Although we had no complaints or concerns brought forward by any student, parent, or resident, we will remove this language from our current dress code information in the student handbook. So no parent or no student, according to the superintendent, was against banning satanic clothing. Only this one group was, and that was enough to convince them. Once again, the community was silent, and the community didn't really want kids to be able to wear satanic clothing, and therefore they banned it. Completely arbitrary, based on nothing more than taste and prejudice and disgust, and anathema to, again, what education is supposed to be doing. Let me give you another example. An Alaska school board banned books like The Great Gatsby. This is from Fox News. Books like The Great Gatsby, The Invisible Man, and so many other books. This school board decided to ban them for various reasons, again, that relate to taste, and that are reflected, again, in that broader community as opposed to what is true and what does not disintegrate under the light of reason, which their claims most certainly do. Let's dissect a specimen from one of their sentiments. The board member, Jeff Taylor, one of the board members, Jeff Taylor, he described the controversial content contained therein in these books as, and I quote, things that are pretty serious problems, especially in our teenage world. Now, I didn't know that teenagers were getting caught up because of The Great Gatsby's profanity or the sexual references that are in Maya Angelou's Cage Songbird. I didn't know that. I thought that teenagers had historically low attention rates, which means they don't really read that much, but instead they go on TikTok where their souls go to die within 60-second sound bites of just commercialized nonsense that does nothing more than feed a habit, which is destroying their ability to understand the world in the way that the world needs to be understood. I thought that was the fundamental problem, Jeff Taylor. I thought that, man, okay, let me just go on. Let me just move on, because apparently Maya Angelou is the fundamental problem. He also went on to say, to justify his beliefs, is there a reason that we include books that we even label as controversial in our curriculum? I would prefer these were gone. Well, number one, a book's controversial nature is incidental to its content. A book can be quite controversial and yet still have a lot of value, because controversy is simply a reflection of social attitudes, and social attitudes are no more a example or a proof of something's value than my preference for a Chevrolet over a Hyundai is a proof of the value of either car. Both are cars, both work. Some people like other things than me, and other people like other things. That is not, again, a substantive reason that adheres to the content of that thing that would allow me to make a value judgment. Now, perhaps if a Hyundai does not have a wheelchair ramp and I am a disabled person, I need that, perhaps that is a substantial reason that I would get a minivan instead. But no, this man's desires, which are reflected most likely in that community, because that community is very small and conservative, are simple tastes, and they're being inflicted upon the children through policy created by an organization, a board, that again reflects those tastes and has no regard for the truth. Then we have the Tennessee school board banning the book Mouse, which is, many progressives got upset about this actually. Not because it was untrue or subjective, like critical race theory and DEI, which have no place in schools, by the way, most certainly are, but because Mouse was too graphic. Now, all Mouse is, it's a children's book which shows an illustration of the Holocaust, but since it's graphic, we can't have that. This is an example of a traditionalist safe space. This is an example of someone not wanting to have history taught because history itself offends their sensibilities. Remember, tastes. And again, there's actually research on why conservatives tend to be more disgusted than liberals. And we understand that. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Disgust can be a very powerful and helpful emotion, but disgust that overrides our ability to reason does nothing more than do a disservice to us in the pursuit of truth. In Indiana, this is the more egregious example. In Indiana, a Jimtown high school student hit a Jimtown high school teacher who had been there for decades, hit a student with his palm wide open, knocked the student's head against the concrete pavement. And instead of the community condemning that man, a few things happened. Students organized a walkout to support him, to keep him from losing his job. The school board let him retire. This is while the criminal investigation and CPS were involved. Let him retire with pension in a unanimous decision. And a change.org petition was launched by members of the community to preserve his job. And when the school board voted for him to keep his pension, cheers and applause erupted from community members who were in attendance at that meeting. No boos, no jeers, no condemnation. Now, I presume there were people in the community that condemned his actions, and I'm certainly sure they did. But the ones who were in control did not. Or at least they'll say they did, but their actions will convey another story. My friends, I can go down the list exhaustively of the examples of right-wing communitarianism and left-wing communitarianism overrunning the education system and inflicting a set of values, whether it be gender identity and critical race theory, whether it be an aversion towards taste or graphic things and novellas or satanic clothing. I can go down the list. The point is this: school boards are merely extensions of the communities they represent, and those communities may not have very good ideas. And those not very good ideas may also be not just not very good, but antithetical to the truth and antithetical to the first principle of education. And education, as the classics understood, was meant to make the man into someone who could appreciate the world around him, not exist within a politically constructed world crafted by one side or the other. And that is what is being missed. A adherence to first principles, which are being slaughtered on the altar of political sensibilities. That is what most education governance in this nation represents. So what do we do about it? My friends, it is time for all of us to reject the public school system. It is time for all of us to reject any kind of governing body. I don't care if it's as local as your downtown post office or as abstract as a Washington ballroom full of bureaucrats. We need to reject any kind of political pipeline that goes in to dilute the quality of education or dilute it in the name of enhancing it that your kids receive. Children around this nation will remain under assault by political ideas, whether it be gender identity or critical race theory, for as long as politics is permitted to go ahead and control what they learn. I don't want left-wing indoctrination. I don't want right-wing indoctrination. I simply want the truth to be taught, and the truth should consist in ripening the faculties, helping people get better at some basic core skills, and leaving everything else up to them as they continue to grow up and explore life in their own idiosyncratic way. That's what happened with me. I had a very unique journey, which I'll go into some other day. But that's what happened with me. And look where I've ended up. Look where my life is right now. And that's what can happen to any other person if we simply allow kids to learn what is necessary and to seek out on their own what they want that is superfluous or secondary to what is necessary. Think on it. My friends, I love you guys so much. If you love me, please support me on Patreon, patreon.com/officialcwatson. Please join my Discord. I love talking to you guys, which is in the comment section down below. My locals, please join my locals because I'm trying to get locals started. It's christianwatson.locals.com. We have a lot of exciting stuff coming on locals. Please join that. And just please like, share, comment, subscribe to this channel, share this video. This message is long, but it's dynamite, and it will help people. I know it will. I pray it will, at least. And it is my prayer that this video has helped you as well in understanding this issue. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.